Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 22 Part 4. Let's get straight back into it with a look at the pump and reservoir configuration that I'm going to use in this build. Now around the time I started my channel there was actually no way of directly connecting a pump and reservoir into a single unit like this one. And this is a configuration that I wanted for such a long time. Every time I used the tube reservoir, I used to do this configuration that was almost a hint. I had this tiny little fitting between the tube reservoir and the pump so that there was the smallest possible gap. I think BitsPower might have been the first and then everyone else followed. And now it is so common that just about everyone who uses tube reservoirs uses a configuration like this one. I have here the original reservoir, which is the EK-X3 Res 400, and the original pump, which is an EK-D5 pump, which came in a package with the EK-X-Top in Plexi and also this mounting system. Now, the problem with these components is that this is a standalone pump top, as you can see. The reservoir cannot connect to it. And I mean, since this configuration was released, I've used it in every single build, every time I use a tube reservoir. I mean, I'm not going to go back. And so I can't use this configuration in this build, having the pump and reservoir separated. So with EK components, if you want a standalone pump top, you get the X-Top. If you want a pump and reservoir configuration, you get the X-Res. And so basically the only difference is the pump top. So this pump top has a thread in the top of it for the reservoir tube. The problem is with EK components, you can't actually purchase all of these components separately. You have to purchase them in a package. And so that's why I have the EK X-Res 140 Revo with the D5 PWM pump, just so that I can get that pump top, so that I can get a connected pump and reservoir. But before I do anything, this reservoir is dirty and scratched. It really needs a good polish. The pump and res config is ready to be installed. I've taken the EK Revo X-Res 140 and I've combined it with the EK X3 400mm reservoir tube. And this has given us a perfect length pump and res config for this build. But before I can install it, we are still in the middle of test fitting to get the perfect position for this pump and res config. So I need to continue installing the rest of the components. Let's take a look at the fans and radiator that we have for this build. You may notice coolant on some of these components. The system was never actually booted and used, but the loop was partially filled and at some point there must have been a leak. So everything needs to be completely dismantled and it needs a really good clean. Because of the design of this case, everything is in full view, almost every component. And so it makes each component so much more important. Each component becomes a major feature. For example, the fans are going to be over here, forward facing, in full view. And so right from the start, when the color scheme had white in it, I recommended noise blocker E-loops with their beautiful white blades. They would have been absolutely perfect. But when the color scheme became black, silver, and blue, I recommended EK Vardar with the silver blades, Noctua Redux, or just Noise Blocker Black Silent Pro with their beautiful black understated design. All premium fans with excellent specifications. These are Thermaltake ring fans. The specifications are 800 to 1500 RPM, 0.57 to 2.01 millimeters H2O, 22.14 to 40.6 CFM, 18.5 to 26.4 decibels. The aesthetics of these fans are just not going to be enough for this build, in my opinion. And, to me, they're quite similar to Corsair's fans, but, I don't like putting things down, so I'm kind of lost for words. But RGB in a fan, fine if it's fully integrated without all of the extra wiring and controllers. I don't mind having RGB on a motherboard where it's fully integrated. But having to do all of this extra wiring for, all of this extra mess just for a little feature, RGB, which we can't even use in this build anyway because we're actually going to be using UV coolant. So we need to have UV lighting only in this build. And, in a fan, I think RGB is just a bit too much. I want fans that are clean, understated, and just do their job and do it really well. Quiet, high performance, elegant, understated fans is what I want in my builds. And so let me know which fans you would prefer to use in this build, considering the color scheme. We have a good radiator though, the XSPC RX480, which is 56 millimeters thick with a 46 millimeter thick core, 13 FPI split fin array, 632 threads, and it has the extra inlet and outlet on the top, which is a great feature. I could use this quite a lot, and I might even be able to use this in this build. I decided to flush the graphics card water blocks at the same time as the radiator. So all of the water cooling components have now been flushed, cleaned up, and they're ready to be installed into the new build. Now, I was surprised at how much gunk came out of the XSPC radiator. I knew they were a bit worse than other radiators, particularly Black Ice, which almost have nothing come out of them. But, 90% of the time when I flush radiators before I use them, I get something out of them. So you always need to flush your radiators before use. Now, you're probably wondering how I clean up my components, because you may have noticed that the graphics cards, particularly the back plates, had finger marks and mess all over them. Well, usually I use a very weak alcohol with water, because the thing about alcohol is that it removes the oils from your hands, which is extremely important. When you're building a system, if you leave behind all of your finger marks, those surfaces, particularly metal surfaces, plated surfaces, are going to corrode very quickly. And actually, there's an area on one of these graphics cards, just here, I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick that up, but there's already rust brown spots appearing, which is corrosion from finger marks. So on a almost new component, it shows you how important it is that you clean it up. You can see that I've installed the graphics cards. They have not been upgraded. They are from the previous build. They are MSI Lightning GTX 980 Ti's, which you can probably see from the extra PCB width. The water blocks are EK nickel acetal and the back plates are EK nickel plated, so a great looking config for this build. Now, the spacing compared to the previous build has changed, so I've had to change the SLI bridge. This is the one from the old build, and I've upgraded it, as you can see, to another EVGA SLI bridge. I absolutely love these SLI bridges. I use them in just about all of my builds, and for this build, it just matches up perfectly. So the build is finally starting to take shape. I've also completed the custom wiring for the core components at this point for the Be Quiet Dark Power Pro 1200 watt power supply, which is only partially modular. As you can see, it has a hardwired 24-pin cable. And this does make it a bit more difficult and time consuming for cable sleeving, but I think a bit more fun, because if you want to do it properly at least, you need to pull apart the power supply casing, completely dismantle it, so that you can run your sleeving back inside of the power supply casing. And, it turns out really, really clean. This is something that we had to do back in the old days a lot before most power supplies became modular. It only becomes really time consuming if, when you sleeve the cable, it obviously becomes a lot thicker, roughly twice as thick, depending. And so sometimes it can become too thick for the hole in the casing, and then you need to modify the casing, which means cutting it, repainting, so then it takes a lot more time. The sleeving is MDPCX, as always. I've used MDPCX for many years now. I've never used anything else, and I never will. I absolutely love it. It's 100% manufactured in Germany. The quality, it's premium sleeving. all of the different colors. I mean, every color you can dream of, and such beautiful colors. We haven't really made the most of the colors here. We've just used mostly black, but as you can see, a single streak of blue, which is actually B-Magic. Some of you might have forgotten that blue is part of the color scheme for this build. It's in the custom paint job, just a very fine, subtle blue flake, which actually stands out a lot more in real life. You know, it really sparkles in real life. And there is one more place blue is going to be, which is in the coolant. I'm going to use Mayhem's X1 Clear UV Blue in combination with UV lighting. So I think the subtle blue throughout the build is going to match up very nicely. So we have the 24-pin, all of the PCIe, and the 8-pin EPS and the 4-pin ATX. The cable combs are from IceMods. So I'm very happy with the way this custom wiring has turned out. As always, all of the wire has been replaced from the ground up, new wire, new pins and connectors, which is the way I always do it, and also with 16 gauge wire. The radiator is installed, and at last we can get the position for the pump and reservoir configuration, which there's just a perfect gap for. The layout of this case is excellent. And what I'm probably going to do is put it as close to the radiator as possible to make plenty of room for the custom cables, particularly the PCIe cables. Either that or I'll center it between the ends of the graphics cards and the radiator. But I would really like to have my voice for explaining this next part, so I'm going to leave this part of the build log here. Thanks for watching, and remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons.